All right. Pressed record. We shall begin. All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Community Social Services Anti-Racism and Cultural Safety in the Workplace webinar. My name is Satminder Bastran. I'm with the Community Social Services Health and Safety Association of BC. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I would like to acknowledge the territories and the lands of the First Nations the speakers are presenting you from today. And we would like to acknowledge the lands and the territories of the First Nations and territories of the territories that you are calling in to participate in this really important webinar. As the intention of the webinar is to engage with our members, employers, workers, partners in a unionized, non-unionized work environment to have the discussion around this very meaningful type of topic and to raise the level of awareness and the challenges that we're facing regarding anti-racism and cultural safety in the workplace. Before we begin, there's just a few minor things that I'd like to share with you, sort of housekeeping items. This session is being recorded for future reference and for education purposes as well. And we have a YouTube channel now, so please be sure to access that channel. And as they say, please like it and subscribe. There's lots of good information there. I know organizations are using snippets of that information on the webinar, of the past recorded webinars in their education component. As for questions for this webinar, please post them in the chat. We'll do our very best to coordinate in the background to get those questions to the speakers as well so that they can respond to you. They may be able to respond during or in the middle of their presentation or towards the end of the session potentially, but based on the number of questions that are raised, we'll be very mindful to raise them to the speakers to answer them. Now, the information, you don't need to write everything down. The presentations will be posted on our webinar as well, and you'll get access to that information once it's up. And there will be a survey that will be sent out. Please complete it. It really helps us a lot in developing and improving future training for the industry as well. And you will also be getting a certificate of attendance for attending this session this morning. So I'm delighted to introduce Harrison Mack from CSS. He's an active member on the Association Advisory Panel. I've had the good pleasure of working with him over the last a year and a half. I'm also delighted to have Terry Nakayama, who's also an advisory panel member, who's been very, very active, who'll be presenting today as well. And so there will be some work in the background. You'll see Anna and David and a few other people and myself just trying to coordinate things. And so we'll make sure that the tech stuff is addressed to the best of our abilities as we're navigating through this process. Now, I'm really confident that Eric, Laura, Alex, and Terry will be providing you excellent information this morning and resources at this session. The whole topic, the subject matter with respect to this issue is something that's really important, and I'm sure that Harrison will be able to articulate it much better than I will be able to. And so with that, we'd like to thank you for attending. It matters. And Harrison, I'll pass it over to you, and thank you.
All right. Thank you, Satvinder. Hello and good morning, everyone across the province of British Columbia, and good day if you're watching a recording of this session online at a future date. Welcome to our webinar today on anti-racism and cultural safety. I'm Harrison Mack, Human Resources Business Partner at CSS, and also an advisory panel member here at the Community Social Services Health and Safety Association. Quite lengthy, so it's CSSHSA for short. So as we approach the first provincially recognized Truth and Reconciliation Day, I do find this topic of anti-racism and cultural safety to be extremely fitting. Somewhat related, but that's not what the reason why we arrived at where we are here today. Reason how all of this started came about from the issue of anti-racism or anti-Asian racism, to be specific, being brought up at our advisory panel. So more to come on this slightly later. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I would like to first start off with a piece of news. So just hold on for one moment while Anna pulls that slide up for me. And one more slide, please, Hannah. Thank you. And after that, I'll follow it with some statistics and research. Then I will explain more about how this webinar came about and why we're delivering this webinar in the format, shape, and form that it is today. So some of you may or may not be aware of this community level news that happened a few days ago in the Tri-Cities area of the Lower Mainland. So there were signs posted around the community for whites only event with the subtext expressing dissatisfaction at how non-Europeans are in the community. And this issue now has prompted the city of Coquitlam to issue a statement and is currently under investigation from the RCMP. And I can definitely share that, here at Success, we do operate within this community in the Tri-Cities area, and that our clients and our staff are definitely affected by this incident. As a result, we are having dialogue internally on this topic, and it does show that why our webinar today is pertinent to current events. We may think that today in a diverse and open country like Canada, that racism is mostly behind us, and there are only sporadic instances where racist confrontations take place, but that's not true. Working in an organization that is headquartered in Vancouver's Chinatown neighborhood has put this issue on my radar as my own personal safety and the safety of my colleagues are definitely at risk. Racism is a conversation that continually takes place in our Joint Health and Safety Committee and also our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Based on statistics from the Vancouver Police, hate crimes rose by 717%, so that's 7 times, over 7 times during the pandemic. Although numbers have gone down slightly recently, but the police has also mentioned that some attacks don't meet the standard for hate crimes, but they may be racially motivated. And to top that off, multiple instances of the Chinatown Millennium Gate Guardian lines being defaced, that sends a very powerful message that racism is still around. This gate, along with the lion, sits right outside of our front entrance to our head office. And to those that are not aware, the lion is a symbol of protection in the Chinese culture. So by the very act of defacing these lines, it sends a very powerful message to the Chinese community and the Asian community at large that their safety is at risk. And this is not something that happens only in Vancouver's Chinatown. And new Vancouver police data indicates that anti-Asian racist incidents occurred across the city. It happened on street corners, on buses, on the SkyTrain, in parks, inside businesses, at church, inside City Hall, at the Chinese Cultural Center, inside public washrooms, at gas station, inside the lobby of an apartment building, and so forth. Am I right now saying that we're in a dangerous place and that we could be attacked at any moment and our lives are in danger? Well, no, that's not true. But the truth is that racist incidents do take place and they can happen at any time without any signs. And to add on to the statistics piece that I've just shared, I would like to reference from academic research on anti-Asian racism and how racist confrontations in general are underreported. From a peer-reviewed article from 2021, it highlighted a few reasons why Asian victims are less likely to report hate crimes to the police. First, there is a perception that law enforcement is biased towards the majority, and which meant that those that are victimized by racism do not trust authorities in acting in their interest. Second, there's the model minority stereotype, which Asians generally works very hard and perseveres through hardship. And this is explained through the piece of socio-cultural differences, whereby Asians in general, due to living in a more collectivist society, their problems are usually internalized, and that seeking for help from others is a sign of weakness. And lastly, the article mentions that by reporting problems like racist incidents, Asians feel that the social harmony within our community can be violated. And then from the conclusion of this article, it does link it with other groups. So things, groups like the Black community, the Hispanic community, and other racialized communities, that by sharing they do share similar reasons, and that racist incidents are likely underreported in general. Now, linking what I've just mentioned on the statistics, examples, and research, back to the beginning, when I first mentioned about our CSS HSA advisory panel, similar information was shared, amongst our panel members, our panelists in one of our panel meetings earlier this year in 2023. And we thought that would be a great idea to host a webinar to increase awareness of the issue of anti-Asian racism and the reporting and the underreporting of incidents back in May when it was Asian Heritage Month. Our initial objective was to hope that more people would come out and report if they've encountered racist incidents, especially in the workplace. However, as Satvinder, myself, and other panelists held more conversations on how to deliver the session in a more succinct way, it soon became very apparent that there were so many other interrelated pieces, which were all linked to preventing people from speaking out and reporting, and of course that includes workers at our workplace. And it can be because staff don't feel safe, to share instances of racism with their staff, their peers, and supervisors. It could also be that people are not aware of the avenues which they can report discrimination or bullying harassment. It could be that organizations themselves don't have a robust diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, and culture in place. And it could also be that people are not aware of their responsibilities of when to act and what to do if such an incident occurred. We know that we had to provide a webinar that can tie in all of these pieces together in a holistic manner, and that evolved from our initial topic of anti-Asian racism to the over more arching topic that we're talking today, which is anti-racism and cultural safety webinar that we have here. And to add a further piece about the importance of addressing the topic today is the fact that in 2022, just last year, the Government of Canada welcomed over 430,000 new permanent residents to Canada. And at the same time, the federal government also aims to welcome up to 500,000 new residents each year. So that's already committed up to the year 2025. So 500,000 new residents each year. So we are becoming an even more culturally diverse nation with an ever-increasing number of newcomers to our country. It may give rise to more conflicts, resulting in even more racist incidents. That's why it is important for all of us here that we equip ourselves with the know-how and the resources that can aid us in facing this new landscape. Now, in order for us to tackle this interconnected and complex issue, we have invited 4 fantastic speakers with expertise from different areas. Each of the speakers will share a short presentation on their expertise, and after the presentations, we will gather together for panel discussion. First, we have Eric Tupholme, Prevention Officer from WorkSafe BC. He will focus on bullying, harassment, and violence prevention. He will also talk about responsibilities of workers and employers. I know that Eric has his own introduction later, so I'll leave it to him to share more information in his presentation. Then we have Laura Track, Human Rights Clinic Director at the Community Legal Assistance Society, CLAS, who will talk about discrimination and human rights with a focus on the legal perspective and complaints process of the Human Rights Tribunal. After that, we have Alex Izunza, advocate at the Community Social Services Employers Association, who will talk about policies and best practices at the workplace with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And finally, we have Terry Nakayama, fellow panelist at our CSS HSA advisory panel and HR manager at Starbright Children's Development Center. She's a professional with training in the areas of cultural safety, psychological health and safety, anti-racism, and inclusion and diversity. Terry will talk about cultural safety at the workplace along with best practices that would take place at the workplace. And of course, we do welcome your questions, so please use the chat function to submit your questions to our wonderful moderator, Anna Mateus. She will relay them to us for the panel discussion. So without further ado, I will pass the mic over to Eric to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Harrison. I'll just get this set up. All right. Is my presentation showing, Harrison?
Yep,
Yes,
we can see it. Looks good.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks for that, Harrison. Yeah, my name is Eric Tupholme. I'm from WorkSafe BC. I'm a prevention officer based out of Kelowna. And part of my portfolio is bullying and harassment and psychological health and safety throughout the province. It's a couple teams that I, why did it stop sharing there? All right. So it's a couple of the teams that I supervise throughout the province. So we don't have regulations specific that speak to anti-racism in, using those words specifically, but we do have a couple sections of the regulation where employers are supposed to address, bullying, harassment, violence, workplace conduct, and a lot of that would encompass some of this anti-Asian hate and racism, and with some new regulations coming out. So first of all, who is WorkSafe BC? We are a provincial agency dedicated to promoting health and safety in workplaces across BC. We do this by partnering with workers and employers to save lives and prevent workplace injury, disease, and disability, and in this case, psychological injury or physical injury, depending on how severe. Our services include, obviously, education, prevention, compensation, and support for injured workers, and it's a no-fault insurance to protect employers and workers. My department is prevention, and we're the ones that you would see out in the field coming to a work site to do an inspection and to look at what employers are doing to meet their requirements under the Act and regulation. And through that process of doing an investigation or an inspection of a workplace, we build awareness through education, consultation with those employers, and in a lot of cases, enforcement, which can either be, order writing or further levels of enforcement up to and including penalties. Try not to get to that point, though, too often. So the focus today, like Harrison had said, is bullying and harassment in the workplace, violence prevention, workplace conduct, the general duties of employers, workers, and supervisors at the workplace, and some harassment resources. And we'll also talk about a new regulation that's coming out. So bullying and harassment in the workplace. So this is the definition of bullying and harassment. It includes any inappropriate conduct or comment by a person towards a worker that person knew or reasonably ought to have known would cause that worker to be humiliated or intimidated. So this bullying and harassment covers everything. We're going to get further into where violence and workplace conduct is a bit separate, but bullying and harassment can be coming from employers, other workers, and members of the public or clients. So employers have to address this, and we'll get into that. But like I say, bullying and harassment encompasses everything and all those interactions with that the worker would encounter throughout their day. So this one isn't separated out. It's not just the public or it's not just workers, and we'll get into that a little bit. And obviously this, it excludes reasonable actions taken by an employer or supervisor relating to the management and direction of workers. But for the most part, most of the complaints we get, they're not because somebody told them how to do their job properly. They're actually legitimate bullying and harassment complaints. So workplace bullying and harassment, it's an occupational health and safety issue that poses a potential risk of physical and mental health and safety to workers. It can take place anywhere at any time, and that includes, it doesn't have to be in person. It can be over the phone. It could be through emails, and anyone can be a target. And it can take, many forms, verbal aggression, personal attacks, other intimidating and humiliating behaviors. Non-violent, not physical violence or threat on your life, but, intimidation and humiliating behaviors. It almost always gets worse if not addressed and can lead to lost productivity, anxiety, and occasional suicidal thoughts or actions. So, and we do get these phone calls. So, it's quite an issue sometimes at some of these places where it actually gets to a point where somebody is having suicidal thoughts. And again, it can affect everybody in the workplace, right? It's not just a person that that's being bullied and harassed. It can impact everybody that's observing this, bystanders, and just a general workplace. So people react differently. Obviously, not everybody's going to react the same way to bullying and harassment. Reactions could include obviously distress, anxiety, some sleep disturbance. There could be physical illness. Obviously, there can be some reduced work performance if this person doesn't feel like they can come into work or don't feel like they're safe at the workplace. Obviously, there can be some impaired concentration as well, right? If you're not feeling comfortable at the workplace, it's really hard to stay focused on the tasks that you've been assigned. So it's really important for employers to address this. yeah, so again, it can reduce efficiency and productivity due to staff morale, increase that stress and tension between workers, higher absentee rates, and I don't think you need to read that. But also it includes more complaints to regulatory agencies like WorkSafe BC and the BC Human Rights Tribunal. And sometimes that can be confusing when people are going back and forth. So hopefully we can have a little bit of clarity on that today so that people like workers understand who they're calling in for what reasons. So it's section 21. So there's no regulation that speaks to an employer having a bullying and harassment program in place or addressing bullying and harassment, but there is a policy under the general duty for an employer's obligation to provide a healthy and safe workplace for their workers. So we'll get into that. So bullying and harassment policies, they were introduced in 2013. So 10 years ago today now. So we're doing a little bit of a revamp on that now that we've had 10 years of employers having to have policies, procedures, and training in place. And we're helping guide that with the new regulation changes that we'll talk about a little later. Watch my time here. So employers must take all reasonable steps to address and prevent bullying and harassment, right? And obviously not engage in bullying and harassment behavior themselves, and apply and comply with the employer's policies and procedures on bullying and harassment. So you can't just have a policy for your workers. You as the employer have to also abide by those. You have to train workers, right? So you've developed a policy that, your employer will not accept bullying and harassment in the workplace. Now you need to have procedures on how workers report and then how those complaints are then investigated. And so obviously you have to train the workers on those policies and procedures, right? And part of that is, how to recognize bullying and harassment in the workplace, how to respond, and how to report. Because, like Harrison said, we've seen this as well in bullying and harassment, and it's getting better. And same with violence, where there is underreporting because workers may not understand what reporting looks like, or that something will be done if they do, or what that looks like. So, it's really important for workers to have an understanding of, first of all, recognizing and how to respond to that, but, making sure that they know who to report it to. And if that person is their bully, then what are the other steps of who they can report that to, right? And sometimes that's coming to WorkSafe BC. You have to annually review your policy statement and your reporting procedures, just to make sure that everybody's still aware of those and that they're still relevant to your workplace at the same time. And that's continued into the new regulations that we'll talk about in a minute here. Yeah, so supervisors, obviously same thing. You have a responsibility not to engage in bullying and harassment and follow the employer's bullying and harassment policies, procedures, and the training that you've gotten. So you may not be the one to address the concern, but you should understand what your role is in that, right? So it's not like other health and safety risks where you can correct an unsafe condition yourself. That may not be possible when it comes to bullying and harassment. It's a little bit of a different health and safety concern than, a physical health and safety risk. So workers, obviously you cannot participate in bullying and harassment, right? You can't be that bully as well, right? You have to treat your coworkers with respect and not do anything that knowingly hurts their feelings, right? Or reasonably ought to have known to hurt their feelings or intimidated them or humiliated them. So, making sure that you're also following your company's workplace bullying and harassment policies, procedures, and reporting when you observe this or are victim of bullying and harassment. Yeah, so same sort of thing. So what to do if you're involved? Obviously, you need to report your employer, follow your procedures, participate fully and honestly in the investigation. These investigations done by the employer are only as good as the evidence that is provided to them or the statements that is provided to them, either by, the person making the complaint, the respondent, or any of the witnesses, right? So making sure that you fully participate in these investigations gives the employer an opportunity to correct that situation more appropriately. So things that we'll get into: workplace conduct and violence. So violence in the workplace. This is actual attempts of physical violence or threats on yours or your family's life. So if you've been threatened that, this person is threatened to injure or worse you or your family, that would be violence, or absolutely the actual exercise of physically assaulting somebody or attempting to assault somebody with violence. So this now is only non-workers. So this is other people that are threatening or attacking or assaulting workers. So this isn't worker on worker violence. This is external. And we'll get into this. I'll talk quickly about it in the next section, but employers must have a risk assessment done. So if there is a risk of violence, and what Harrison was talking about, there's some areas where employers know that there's violence happening. They need to assess that risk, right? And then develop as much as, to their abilities, policies and procedures that can minimize that, and then workplace arrangements. So, sometimes you'll look at, for example, late night retail, they've ended up putting in, balusters around doors so you can't drive into them, one-way locks so that you can't actually come into the building. So there's ways that you may have to address the physical location as well, but that's not always possible. But, the employer must, establish some policies and procedures to minimize the risk of violence of workers if there's a known risk or there's a potential risk, right? And again, this is getting more and more where you can't say anymore that there's no risk of violence. And again, I'll talk about that in the next regulation change. And then obviously you have to inform workers of these policies and procedures, right? Every time you develop policies and procedures, workers then must be informed on how they can protect themselves and how to identify these risks of violence as well that have been identified. And again, these risk assessments can be a living document. It doesn't end when one risk assessment is done. If there's a new risk that a worker brings up, then the employer must address that as well by assessing that and implementing any policies and procedures if necessary. Workplace conduct. So this is improper activity or behavior. So this is the attempted or actual exercise by a worker towards another worker of any physical force so as to cause injury, and includes any threatening statement. So again, if they threaten that they're going to hurt you or worse, that would be workplace conduct. And so this is worker on worker violence. So again, really you shouldn't, this is why this is a separate regulation right now, is because there shouldn't be an expectation of violence from workers to workers, right? And so there's more of an emphasis on this being, workers should not engage in this sort of behavior, right? And that should be obvious, but it's a regulation for a reason. But this is, the employer doesn't have to do quite the same level of, risk assessment and having policies and procedures, just because there really shouldn't be an expectation of this violence. But there is, unfortunately, and so that's why there's a regulation. So again, the employer, has to make sure that this workplace conduct is prohibited. And then if there is reports of workplace conduct, then obviously an employer has to do an investigation into that, right? Because we need to determine why these workers ended up in the situation that they were in, and how can they correct that. And then harassment and violence regulations. So right now they're working at putting bullying and harassment, violence prevention, and workplace conduct into one regulation. And this will address, this risk assessment will then address that further broader kind of scope of violence risks and harassment risks, including external, internal, even some of the, it's not far reaching, but some of the maybe more domestic issues that can then come back and into the, or it can impact the workplace. You'd have to assess those. You may be limited in what your controls are, but you at least have to assess that risk and have some policies and procedures around that should that end up happening at your work site. So it is going to be a lot better to have these all in one areas. It's going to make it a lot more simple for employers to do an assessment of their harassment and violence that may be present at the workplace, and develop policies and procedures for better addressing that, and just make it more clear, because like I say, right now bullying and harassment is a policy item within a general duty, and this puts it nice into a regulation that, you know, employers then have no reason to say, look, I didn't know about that. It's in regulation. So it's right now, it's at public consultation. So if there's any employers on here right now, I encourage you to go and take a look at those new regulations and provide any sort of feedback, because then based on that feedback, we can make sure that we're putting a regulation out there that makes sense to the majority of the employers. It's going to have to hit a broad range of employers, but, you know, with more feedback from different employers, it does provide us an opportunity to meet the needs of those employers. Other than that, I think I got a few resources here just as how, you know, for reporting bullying and harassment, and, you know, how to submit a complaint. But what I want to be clear is, when you're calling WorkSafe BC for bullying and harassment, we do not investigate bullying and harassment. We investigate if the employer did a thorough investigation or an adequate investigation into that, if the workers brought it forward. So if you call in, the person that you speak to on the ICO desk is likely going to ask, have you reported this to your employer? Because if you haven't reported it to your employer, that they haven't had an opportunity to do that investigation, right? So for us, it's important that you've reported it to your employer, and then when you call us, it's, look, the investigation wasn't done properly, or they didn't address my concerns, and then we can investigate what the employer did again. So like we say, we don't investigate the actual bullying and harassment. We investigate whether or not the employer did what they're supposed to. And then, also, if, you know, with bullying and harassment, there comes prohibitive action complaints, where if you've brought up a health and safety concern, then some action has been taken against you, right? You've lost, they fired you, they reduced your hours, they moved you to a new position. Somehow they've taken some action against you for reporting an unsafe condition. There's a process for that at WorkSafe BC as well. But if it comes down to a human rights issue or something, race, sexual orientation, religion, those sorts of things, again, we don't address that. If some action's been taken against you for those reasons, that would be a different area. That would be human rights. That would not be WorkSafe BC. So again, if you call in, you may get that information, and you know, just know that we don't have jurisdiction over that. But if it's prohibitive action taken against you for bringing up a health and safety concern, that's where we step in, and that's why we've changed it to prohibitive action and not discriminatory action like it used to be. So other than that, I hope I didn't go past my time. I can go on a little bit, so I will pass it on to the next person.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for sharing these information with us. Definitely, just to share with everyone as well, that within the association, we did develop a violence risk assessment tool, which is complementary to, what Eric was talking about in terms of the violence piece. And at the same time, there will be continued conversation on, enhancing the current legislation. So please, all of the employers here that are in attendance, we would encourage that you participate in the public consultation. And, as Eric did address, there are issues with discrimination and human rights that's not as, falling under the purview of WorkSafe BC. So that's why we have our next speaker now lined up. Laura Track will be presenting on, the human rights aspect and also the, areas of discrimination. And she can, explain and share more, of her expertise in this area. So Laura, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Harrison, and hello, everyone. My name's Laura Track. I am a lawyer with the Human Rights Clinic at CLASS. CLASS is the Community Legal Assistance Society for short, and CLASS is a nonprofit legal organization that's been providing free legal services in a range of different legal areas to folks for just over 50 years now. We had an anniversary celebration recently. We have a number of different programs at CLASS, and one of our programs or departments is the BC Human Rights Clinic. Our clinic provides free legal services to people who need help with a provincial human rights complaint, and specifically people who have made or are thinking about making a human rights complaint to the BC Human Rights Tribunal, which is what I'm going to tell you about in my time with you today. And I'm actually just going to set a timer because I also can go on sometimes just to make sure that we leave lots of time for our other terrific speakers. We provide a range of legal services to complainants or people who think they may wish to make a human rights complaint. We have an information line, which is staffed Monday to Friday by a real live human being who can answer people's questions, basic questions about human rights, provide referrals and basic information and guidance. We run what we call our short service clinic every Wednesday. It operates from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. and people can sign up for a half an hour of legal advice from a lawyer or a legal advocate at our short service clinic. And those services are available to anyone who has or is thinking about making a human rights complaint. Our legal advice and representation services are by application. And if someone has filed a human rights complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal and had that complaint accepted for filing by the tribunal, they can apply for assistance from a lawyer or one of our legal advocates for assistance with the next steps as that complaint moves through the Human Rights Tribunal complaint process. In addition to our legal services, we also do a lot of education work. So we do free webinars and lunch and learns and trainings for the public and community organizations to help people understand their rights under BC's human rights laws. And we also do education work for those who might find themselves on the other side of a human rights complaint, what are called respondents in the human rights system, those who have obligations, duties under human rights law to prevent and avoid and respond to discrimination when it arises. So we do those kinds of workshops and trainings for employers, HR managers, landlords, educational institutions, other service providers to help them understand their obligations under human rights law in the hopes that we can avoid and prevent discrimination from arising and people from having to file a human rights complaint at all. I always like to start my presentations by pointing to the purposes of our human rights law. And these purposes are actually set out right in the law itself. Section 3 of BC's Human Rights Code sets out a number of different purposes for having a human rights law in the first place. Why do we have this thing? What does it do? And one of the important purposes of the Human Rights Code, and the purpose that I sort of work with day to day, is the purpose of providing an accountability mechanism, a means of redress for people who have experienced discrimination. So the Human Rights Code creates a complaints process by which people who have been impacted by discrimination can file a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal against the person or entity that discriminated against them and seek accountability through the Human Rights Tribunal complaint process. But the purposes of the code are much broader and I think more aspirational than that, than just addressing discrimination after the harm has been done. The Human Rights Code also exists to try to prevent arbitrary and unfair exclusion or disadvantage, to promote accessibility and inclusion, to promote the more proactive removing of barriers to participation in our daily lives, in work, in public spaces. The Human Rights Code exists to promote a climate of understanding and mutual respect and to try to address systemic patterns of inequality and discrimination. So it is meant to guide people on how to prevent and proactively avoid discrimination from happening at all. Unfortunately, the complaints process, which is what I'm going to speak to you about now, really is a backward-looking process. Folks file human rights complaints after they have experienced discrimination and that harm has really been done. So it's important to know about this tool when discrimination arises, but it's also so important to take to heart, I think, the presentations that we're going to hear after mine about the policies and practices and steps that can be taken in our workplaces and in the services that we deliver to the public to ensure that we proactively try to address potential sources of discrimination, of marginalization, of disadvantage that our systems may be creating. so that we don't have to rely on individuals to come forward and file human rights complaints after the harm has been done. BC's Human Rights Code, as I've mentioned, protects people from discrimination. And sometimes people are confused by this. They hear the language of a human rights code and they think the protections are much broader than they are. The Human Rights Code doesn't necessarily protect all of the things that we think of as part of our human rights. When I think of human rights, I think of the right to housing and the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to clean water. But BC's Human Rights Code isn't that broad. What the Human Rights Code protects us from is discrimination that's connected to our protected characteristics. And I'll show you what the protected characteristics are in a moment. And the Human Rights Code doesn't protect us from all discrimination anywhere it occurs. It protects us from discrimination that arises in three main areas of our daily lives. It protects us from discrimination in our employment. It protects us from discrimination in our housing, like from a landlord, let's say, or from a strata council. And it protects us from discrimination in our access to services and facilities that are offered out to the public, things like stores and businesses, the services provided by an educational institution, by the police. These all have to be provided in a non-discriminatory way. And so the examples that Harrison was sharing with us at the beginning of this presentation about the anti-Asian racism and hate that we have heard increased so much during the pandemic, many of those instances of clear discrimination, clear racism and hate arose in areas like someone walking down the sidewalk, getting into their car in a parking lot at a store, areas that are not protected by BC's Human Rights Code. We fielded a lot of questions about that as these instances were occurring in those early days of the pandemic, and had to deliver the difficult news that unfortunately our Human Rights Code, our anti-discrimination protections, simply don't provide a mechanism for seeking accountability and redress for those situations because they didn't arise in one of these three protected areas. So the Human Rights Code protects us from negative treatment in our jobs, in our tenancies, and in our access to services when that negative treatment is connected to protected characteristics. These are, as you can see on the screen here, aspects of our identities, of who we are, that we're entitled not to be treated differently or badly on the basis of. And I'm not going to go through all of the protected characteristics, but you can see them on your screen there. They include things like our race and ethnic identities, religion, our sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression is protected, and so forth. I want to emphasize that everyone in BC is protected by the Human Rights Code. You don't have to have been here for 3 months before you have the protections. You don't have to be a citizen or have, clear documented immigration status. Doesn't matter how old you are. All workers are protected from discrimination in the context of their work, even if they're unpaid interns or volunteers not getting paid. So the protections are very broad. If the discrimination occurred in BC, it is prohibited by the BC Human Rights Code, provided that it connects to a protected characteristic and arose in one of the protected areas. So that's just sort of reiterating what I've said before. And as I've said, the Human Rights Code protects us from discrimination, which means in human rights law, treating someone badly on the basis of one or more protected characteristics. That's what's known as direct discrimination. Someone is sort of targeted, singled out, treated badly because of a protected characteristic, or perhaps more than one protected characteristics. We know that sometimes discrimination and sources of oppression sort of intersect and overlap to impact people on multiple aspects of their identities. Discrimination in human rights law can also include something a little more subtle, a little more difficult to spot sometimes than direct discrimination. It can also include a situation involving what seems like a neutral policy or practice or requirement or rule that applies to everyone and applies to everyone equally, but has discriminatory impacts on certain people or groups in connection with their protected characteristic. So an example like that might be a workplace policy that requires folks to be available to work on Friday nights. Friday nights, you got to be available. Well, some people in connection with their religion may attend mosque on Friday nights and not be available to work. And so that workplace policy, which, doesn't intentionally single anybody out for discrimination, could have a discriminatory impact on certain people in connection with their protected characteristic of religion. Eric spoke to us about harassment and bullying and how harassment and bullying creates an unsafe work environment and is therefore a work-safe issue and something that folks may seek to report to WorkSafe. Harassment and bullying may also constitute a human rights violation, may violate the Human Rights Code, may be discriminatory, again, when it connects to a protected characteristic. So certainly we know that some harassment and bullying is, not necessarily connected to a protected characteristic. It's just this person is mean or a jerk and engages in unacceptable conduct, but doesn't have a connection to the target's personal protected characteristics. But when that harassment or bullying is connected to, for example, someone's race, someone's place of origin, making fun of where someone comes from, making fun of their accent or their style of dress or cuisine, when somebody's being bullied because of their sexual harassment, singled out and treated differently because of their gender identity or their disability or their religion or any other protected characteristic. Now we have a discrimination situation. And now this person might report to WorkSafe, as Eric described to us, but also consider filing a human rights complaint. And discrimination can look so many different ways. There are so many different ways that discrimination can manifest in the workplace, in our tenancies, in our access to services and facilities, but things like stereotyping people, making unfair assumptions about someone because of their membership in a particular group, that can be discrimination. Bullying and harassment, we've just talked about, singling someone out and treating them differently because of their religion or their sexual orientation or whatever it might be. We know racial profiling continues to impact Black and Indigenous populations in particular, as well as other communities of color, people being profiled, targeted for surveillance and suspicion because they are not white. Discriminatory and poisoned work environments may be discriminatory if the workplace has become sexualized or there's a racist sort of culture in the workplace. That can violate the Human Rights Code. And in fact, one of the most common types of human rights violations is an employer's failure to accommodate a person's protected characteristics, such as the employer that refuses to accommodate the Muslim worker who needs to attend mosque on Friday night and is not available to work, or the person with the disability who needs a ramp to their workstation or other potential accommodations to meet their disability-related needs. Filing a human rights complaint involves submitting a story, a narrative, a chronology of events to the BC Human Rights Tribunal. The BC Human Rights Tribunal is what's called an administrative tribunal. It's like a court, but a bit less formal. And they hear and decide human rights cases. The decision makers don't look like that person in the image there, but they are independent decision makers appointed much like judges to hear and decide these human rights complaints. The Human Rights Tribunal screens cases to make sure, yes, this is something that we can deal with. It arose in a protected area. It alleges discrimination on the basis of one or more protected characteristics. It occurred within the last year. That's important to know about making a human rights complaint. There's a 1-year limitation period. And so the tribunal screens cases to make sure, okay, those, requirements are met. And then the case moves through the process. If someone goes to a hearing of their complaint and is successful in proving their complaint of discrimination, then the tribunal can order the respondent, whether it's an employer, a landlord, or maybe a service provider, can order that respondent to provide compensation to the complainant for the impact of the discrimination, as well as other expenses that they may have had to incur or financial losses that they may have had due to the discrimination. Maybe they were out wages for 3 months because they were terminated for a discriminatory reason. It took them a while to find a new job. Their former employer might have to pay them for those 3 months of wage loss while they were looking for new work, for example. One thing that surprises people sometimes about the Human Rights Tribunal is that it does not proactively investigate complaints. Sometimes people think that if they just draw a situation to the tribunal's attention, that someone from the tribunal will go out and, interview witnesses and, force the respondent to change their practice, for example. And for better or for worse, that's not how it works. The Human Rights Tribunal is much more like a court where if you bring a complaint forward, it will be your burden to bring the evidence forward to support your complaint and to prove your complaint on what's called a balance of probabilities. You have to persuade the tribunal that it's more likely than not that the discrimination occurred. The Human Rights Tribunal is free to access. There's no fee for filing a complaint. You don't have to pay for your days of hearing or anything else. And the tribunal also provides free mediation services so that they have a roster of mediators that can work with the parties to try to resolve the complaint without the need for that more formal adversarial hearing where you have to prove your case. At a mediation, the parties can work together to try to come up with a solution and a resolution that can allow the complaint to sort of stop there and be resolved through a settlement. So what a complainant has to prove in a human rights complaint is 3 things. First, they have to prove that they have a protected characteristic. We saw that big list a moment ago. Usually that's not too controversial. Obviously, everyone has a race, a gender, a sexual orientation, and so forth. Sometimes some evidence is required if you need to prove that you had a disability, for example, but usually this number 1 here is pretty easy to prove. Second, the person has to prove that they experience some kind of negative treatment or what's sometimes called an adverse impact in a protected area. And again, this is not usually controversial. It's usually pretty obvious if someone's experienced a negative impact. They got fired, they got evicted, they couldn't access the particular service, whatever it may be. But what is usually the most difficult part of any human rights complaint is proving the connection between those 2 things. You have to prove that your protected characteristic was a factor in the negative treatment or negative impact. So for example, you have to prove that your race was at least part of the reason why you didn't get the promotion. Or I would have to prove like my pregnancy was the reason I got terminated a week later after announcing my pregnancy, for example. You have to prove a connection between the negative thing that happened and the protected characteristic. The respondent can defend their actions by saying, well, there's a non-discriminatory explanation. Your pregnancy had nothing to do with the termination. We were restructuring the department and getting rid of the legal section. So even if you hadn't been pregnant, you would have lost your job. Or your race had nothing to do with not getting the promotion. There were other more qualified candidates, for example. That could be a defense that there's no connection between the protected characteristic and the negative thing. Respondents can also defend their conduct by trying to show the treatment was justified. So yes, maybe a person with a disability was not hired for this particular role, but that was justified because of the nature of the role and the nature of the job duties. It's a really physical job. We need this person to be able to be on their feet 8 hours a day and lifting boxes or climbing ladders or whatever it might be, and unfortunately couldn't hire a person with mobility limitations for that job, but it's justified given the nature of the job duties, for example. Those are two ways that respondents might defend a human rights complaint. And I know I've been talking a lot about proof and the burden of proving a human rights complaint. And I bet many of you are thinking, how would I ever prove discrimination? Discrimination happens in a really subtle way in many cases, happens behind closed doors, often without any witnesses present, right? You rarely see, the racist intention or the, homophobic comment in a text message or in an email. We rarely have, a document or clear persuasive evidence to establish discrimination. And you're not wrong. It can be difficult to prove discrimination, but the tribunal recognizes that discrimination can be subtle, discrimination can be unintentional. And it's important to know that just because there's no witness or no, real smoking gun document, that doesn't necessarily mean a human rights complaint is doomed to fail. The tribunal can listen to all of the evidence and make findings of fact about what they believe actually happened based on the credibility of the witnesses. They look at all of the circumstances in the case to decide whether the complainant has met their burden of proof. Before I close, and I'm out of time, I know, I just want to share this last slide here, which is a list of resources. And I understand these slides will be shared with you down the road. This is a list of resources for legal help with human rights complaints. I maybe a bit presumptively put our human rights clinic there at the top, but it really is all we do. We assist complainants with human rights cases. And these other organizations can also provide assistance in human rights cases and also do lots of other things. So I included them as well. And I'm really looking forward to hearing our other panelists and to engaging in some discussion with you all after the presentations are done. So I'm going to stop sharing here and turn it back over to Harrison. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's a lot to pack within, around 20 minutes or so, but, it was a very concise presentation with a lot of information. I personally learned some information from that presentation as well. And as we can see, for all of the participants here today, we know that the first session, the first part where Eric was talking about the bullying harassment piece, and now from Laura on the discrimination piece, these are more of the regulatory types of presentation information. But now let's take a shift and move over to the workplace and understand what type of policies and a little bit more about what companies and organizations can do in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So keep those questions coming. I do see some questions coming in, and we will address all of them towards the end. And now I would like to introduce Alex Azunza from our CSS EA to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the workplace. Over to you now, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Harrison. Just share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Alexandra Insunza. I'm a lawyer and I'm an advocate at the Community Social Services Employers Association. And so I advise employers mainly in the Lower Mainland on labor relations and employment issues. So today I'm going to discuss implementing a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy within your organization. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to refer to this as a DEI policy. I'll discuss best practices in creating a DEI policy. However, please be advised your own DEI policy is best tailored to your organization. So recognizing the current diversity within your organization enables you to further identify potential disparities and develop an understanding of strategies to foster a more equitable and inclusive workplace. I'm going to discuss the benefits of implementing a DEI policy and potential challenges that can arise in making this change. Also, since DEI policies are unfortunately relatively new and quite broad, I'm going to discuss the just the major components that typically arise in a DEI policy and provide examples of DEI clauses that can be used just as a general guideline in creating your own policy. Lastly, I'm going to finish with a short DEI exercise from the Achieve Center for Diversity and Leadership. This can be used for your organization, and we'll see if we have time to get to it. If not, these slides will be available to you. So the benefits of implementing a DEI policy. Expanded talent pool. So focusing on diversity can expand the talent pool that organizations can recruit from. Diverse talent can lead to a wide range of skills, knowledge, and expertise, rather than a workforce with a homogeneous skill set. Improving decision-making. When multiple perspectives are included in the decision-making process, biases and unseen areas can be minimized, and this leads to more well-rounded and informed decision-making. Increased engagement and employee retention. Something that a lot of employers want to achieve. And when employees feel valued and included, they are more likely to be engaged and committed to their work. So this can lead to higher employee satisfaction and ultimately increased retention. And a better understanding of the client population. So a diverse workforce reflects the diverse client population can also aid in meeting the needs at work and better performing within your job. So mitigating risks, fulfilling a legal responsibility to treat everyone fairly and making a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion prior to issues arising can mitigate risks of possible human rights complaints, such as what Laura was just talking about, and or grievances. So it's always good to be proactive. Positive reputation and morale. Organizations that prioritize DEI and follow through with their commitment to DEI can be viewed more positively. And a positive reputation can aid in recruitment and retention and also employee satisfaction. So now on to some of the challenges that can arise when implementing a DEI policy. Ineffective or lack of measuring progress. Collecting meaningful data from where you began to where you are later is very helpful in measuring your progress. You don't know how far you've come if you don't know where you started. In addition to collecting numerical data, employers should also have anonymous surveys and open-ended questionnaires. Maintaining a long-term commitment. So it's really important to have top-down leadership commitment, and it's helpful in maintaining long-term commitment to DEI policies and initiatives. So leaders must lead by example and practice what they're implementing. Lack of representation. A lack of representation from marginalized groups can be an ongoing challenge, and however, without adequate representation, it's very difficult to address and understand the needs of those not represented. And a homogeneous workplace culture. Policies and procedures and practices all need to be evaluated within an inclusive lens where everyone feels valued, respected, and included. And so this is also better attained with a diverse workforce. And bias and stereotypes. Perpetuated, this can hinder DEI efforts. So ongoing education and a conscious assessment of all the unconscious biases that can appear is very necessary. So on to the components of a DEI policy. So number one, purpose. Setting a clear purpose helps explain why you are implementing a DEI policy. So why is this important to your organization? I've included some sample clauses within my presentation. So one would be your agency's name is dedicated to fostering equity, diversity, and inclusion in the administration of its policies, programs, and activities. The objective of this policy is to take a proactive approach and ensure that your agency's name offers equitable opportunities to underrepresented groups. With this objective in mind, this policy aims to outline a fundamental set of principles that have guided the development and implementation of directives for promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion for all persons covered by this policy. So this is just a sample example, and I'll move on to the next slide. So definitions. Now there's many different ways that you can define diversity, and this is just a very very short example of diversity as a definition within your policy. So this involves recognizing and respecting everyone's unique qualities and attributes, but focuses particularly on groups that remain underrepresented. Your definition could also include what Laura was previously talking about, your protected characteristics. It could be a lot longer than this or a lot more concise. So equity, the equitable and respectful treatment of all individuals, establishing equal prospects and mitigating disparities in opportunities. Equity seeks to provide resources, opportunities, and support in a manner that accounts for differences and aims to ensure there are equal opportunities to succeed. Achieving equality may require diverse levels of assistance or intervention from various individuals or groups in order to attain a fair outcome. And lastly, inclusion. The establishment of an atmosphere that fosters a sense of inclusivity and respect for all individuals, with particular emphasis on marginalized groups. This entails creating an environment that enables all members to be fully engaged. And an inclusive group may be diverse, but a diverse group may not always be inclusive. And then setting out the benefits of implementing a DEI policy. We already previously discussed some of the benefits, but I just want to note that it's good practice to acknowledge a clearly outlined benefit within your policy and just making sure that everyone is aware of the benefits for all. And then ensuring there are no systemic barriers, biases. This is a very, very large topic, but put simply, this can be achieved first by acknowledging that unconscious biases exist and becoming aware of what these unconscious biases might be. Then actively challenging assumptions and stereotypes that might perpetuate barriers and adopting fair policies and practices that minimize biases and potential barriers. So I have included some sample clauses for your review later. And then annual training. You might also want to include within your policy that you offer regular DEI training programs and workshops to raise awareness about diversity, unconscious bias, and inclusive practices. So these programs can help employees understand the importance of diversity, challenge their own biases, and develop skills for creating an inclusive work environment. You might also want to offer mentorship, coaching, to build upon this training or engage outside consultants to offer unbiased assessments and perspectives on how things are progressing within your organization. And data gathering in order to assess progress. This is also very important. It's recommended to regularly collect and analyze data on diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics in order to assess your progress and identify areas for improvement. So this data can help track representation, identify disparities, and inform targeted interventions to address any gaps. So some examples of data gathering could be annual audits, anonymous surveys, or inviting group discussions or feedback from employees and management. And lastly, policy review. So it's always good practice to include a statement to assure that the policy will be reviewed regularly. Within this clause, you might want to include who will review the policy and how often, when, and so example of this would be, this policy will be reviewed and updated every 2 years or sooner, if deemed necessary by the board of directors, to ensure current measures are enforced to achieve equity, diversity, and inclusion within the organization. And now for the DEI exercise for your organization. I'm not sure if we have time for this, but it will be available for you in the slides later. And this just helps you assess your organization's strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement in your DEI initiatives. Just go through the slides. All right. And if anyone has any questions or feedback, that would be appreciated. Thank you. And now back to Harrison.
Thank you, Alex, for all of the information shared about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the workplace. So we've gone through, with Eric talking about the regulation from WorkSafe BC, Laura on, from, the legal perspective on human rights, and of course, right now from Alex on, diversity and equity and inclusion. So we did receive some questions beforehand, before our session today. There were questions asking us about, so what's next? What can we do in organizations to promote these practices? So in terms of, being in situations where someone has encountered a racist incident or encountered situations where they may be discriminated against, how can they feel comfortable and safe to talk about this and actually raise this issue to others and also to their employers? That's something that needs to be examined further, and exactly that's why we have our next speaker, Terry Nakayama. She would talk to us about cultural safety and what we can do at the workplace to promote that practice and promote that culture within organizations. So, without any further delay, I'll pass the time over to Terry. Terry, please go ahead.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. And now I'm getting two views here, which is not typical. So Anna, if you're in the background, I'm not sure what's happened here.
It looks good here, Terry.
Okay, then I'll go ahead. I want to thank the team for welcoming me into the group a little bit later on in their developing of this presentation. I recognize that Sat and Harrison are both promoting me as an expert in the field of cultural safety. I don't think anybody can be an expert in cultural safety. I learn something new every day, and hopefully I can share the things that I have learned with you today. So I couldn't do this presentation without dedicating it to the two people who were so determined to make a difference in anti-racism and culture, my parents. My parents made front page news in 1947 because they had the audacity to get married. My mother's parents would not attend the ceremony, and my dad's parents were there and very gracious, but in their time, it just wasn't heard of to have an interracial marriage. And they made the front page of the local news in the Okanogans, noting that, how dare they? And so based on that, cultural safety starts with you. This presentation isn't about me, but it does start with me and sharing my story, because communication is absolutely essential in cultural safety. As you saw, I'm the child of one parent who was Japanese and one parent who was German, Russian, Ukrainian. Both my sets of grandparents came to Canada, one from Japan and one from the Russian-Ukraine border, and to settle in Canada. And in my paternal grandfather's case, he came to Canada, became an orchardist, got his land, and sent for his prearranged bride. On my mother's side, my grandfather came across, settled with his bride, settled in Saskatchewan, and had a family of 14. I bring up the size of the families only because there is unsubstantiating, we're looking into it, but you often hear about truth and reconciliation and residential schools. And it actually turns out that on my mother's side, her family actually was part of residential schools for short term while they were in Saskatchewan. So based on this information, My dad enlisted in the Canadian Army shortly before the end of World War II. He did it out of respect and pride for the country that he lived in and was born in, and he was very proud to serve. However, his time in the Canadian Army and probably understandable, Canada was at war with Japan. So the way he was treated as being in the Army, and the way he was actually treated by others in the community was not nice. And he actually thought he was doing a good thing. And I learned a whole lot about anti-racism and cultural safety from him. He never said a word to us that was disparaging to Canada. He never said a word to us that was disparaging about Japanese. But when I was 6 years old, I had spent a lot of time with my paternal grandmother, and I had learned Japanese culture, and I was absolutely enthralled by Japanese culture until one day when I was about 6 years old, my dad came home and said, "You're not Japanese. You're not going to learn any more of the language. You're Canadian." And so part of cultural safety is finding your truth and reconciling. I was very angry with my dad because I loved the Japanese culture. I loved learning all of the traditions from my grandmother and spending time with her and helping her learn English, and being a part of that culture was important to me, and all of a sudden it ceased. However, when I became a teenager, my dad confided in me, and he let me know that the reason that he wanted me to be Canadian is so that I could be culturally safe. Because everything he went through for us, he didn't want us to go through. We lived fairly sheltered, and we were not targeted by racism, basically because of my dad's experience and his protection of us. So I just wanted to share that story with you because it is very important to the roots in Canada. We're a multicultural nation. All of us, my family, my dad was actually born in Canada. I'm second generation born in the Okanagan. We all come from somewhere else, but we're all treated so differently. Harrison's statistics on different events in racism that have happened so recently are very scary, and we all have to do our part. So for cultural safety, here a brief introduction. You really can't talk about cultural safety without acknowledgement that other factors are intertwined. As we've seen today, anti-racism is a big part of cultural safety. Respectful workplace, as discussed before, is a big part. Violence prevention is a big part. Diversity and inclusion also. Human rights, cultural competency. Psychological health and safety in the workplace is a big part as well. And eliminating unconscious and perceived bias. We all do it. We don't always recognize that we're doing it. You also can't speak about cultural safety in the workplace without recognizing some of the legislation in place, such as the Canadian Multicultural Act, the British Columbia Human Rights Code, the Canadian Human Rights Code, the Employment Equity Act, the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and there's so many more. In researching for this presentation today, I bookmarked an additional 10 acts that I need to explore and find out more about. So the cultural safety roots. The Indigenous population has done an amazing job of discussing cultural safety and from the perspective of the Indigenous in Canada. Actually, the framework for cultural safety started though in New Zealand and Australia. And the Centre for Excellence in Therapeutic Care in Australia describes cultural safety as an environment that is safe for people where there is no assault, challenge, or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. It is about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience of living, learning, and working together with dignity and truly listening. The First Nations Health Authority in the hashtag It Starts With Me, creating a climate for change document describes cultural safety as an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. It results in an environment free of racism and discrimination where people can feel safe. And safety is of utmost importance. So where do you begin in cultural safety in workplace? The first thing you need to do is start the conversation. Conversation, just like any topic, conversation starts off as difficult, but we won't learn anything if we don't start that conversation and take the hard way and ask the difficult questions and learn everything we can learn to keep our staff safe and free from racism in their workplace. A good place to start is by much following the Young Workers program that WorkSafe has in a different avenue. Ensure that your employees know that they're safe and engage in conversation, because our young people can make the difference in the strategies and ideas that work for them. We may learn something new. Always, wherever you can, provide trainings in the area of anti-racism, cultural safety, perceived bias, and trauma-informed practices. You can't really take one of those topics without combining it into all of them. Provide the best, safe, inclusive work environment you can. Eliminate barriers if there are physical barriers, if there are language barriers, if there's cultural barriers, or social barriers. Do your best to make your work inclusive. In an environment where perhaps an agency or an organization celebrates the Christmas holidays or the winter holidays, perhaps there's someone that doesn't believe or whose culture doesn't believe in that time. Create something different. When faced with this, one of the ideas that came out from staff is they developed what was called a pie day, and it was about apple pie and being a day specifically for the employee that couldn't attend other functions but to make them feel included. I'm not suggesting everybody goes out and has a pie day, but use your best inclusion imagination to make that person a part of the team. I recently took the training for the Dare to Lead program that author Brene Brown has, and it is facilitated by Diane Lloyd, and highly recommend it to anybody who's looking for furthering their career in the area of management. She says, you cannot lead if you are not vulnerable. And by making yourself vulnerable, you make everyone else aware that you're okay with being vulnerable to and open to different suggestions. Self-reflection. Change starts with yourself, and examining your own perceived biases and ways to affect change. Always be open in your conversation. Make sure it's two-sided, that it's not a one-sided conversation, and that you end up sharing and conversing. Embrace the cultural difference. Don't make them stand out in a negative way. If people use different languages, for example, perhaps they have a friend that can come in and interpret and show staff exactly what is important in the culture, and explain maybe in ways that the staff may not be able to communicate to you. Use visuals. Nonverbal language is great for communicating and can be representative throughout office space, therapy space. It is a great tool. Create a safe space for staff to go. That could be someone's office. I like to think my office is a safe space, but it could also be a sensory safe room. Maybe there's a room in your organization that you can go turn out the lights and just breathe for 10 minutes before you go back into the bright lights and confusion and noise. So be creative about how you present cultural safety. And again, be receptive to vulnerability. We're all vulnerable. And it takes a lot to open up and talk about what everybody is perceiving as perhaps falsely, what your culture, what your background is, and allow them to come up with ways to be included and act on them. Understanding cultural safety goes a long, long way to eliminating racism in the workplace. Policies. Create a policy. Describe what cultural safety and cultural competency are going to look like in your organization. Link it to your anti-racism policy because one will be part of the description of the other. And always look at it from what does culturally safe look like from your staff's perspective? What does it look from a client's perspective? What are the steps that you want to follow to achieve cultural competencies? How is everybody accountable once you have the policy? What makes them accountable? Share your knowledge and listen and learn actively. And honestly, I have not showed a policy here sample because every one of your organizations are different. Harrison in the Lower Mainland and in the description of all the stats that he's given you is probably in a location that's far riskier than where I live in the Okanagan, so our policy would look a little bit different than Harrison's. But be inclusive of all your staff. Understand what it is that they need out of it and incorporate it into the policy. If you have a quality assurance committee or a committee that actually takes accountability for different departments, I encourage you to do that. I'm always available to help. Although I applaud Harrison and Sat for trying to represent me so well, I'm one of you. I have taken a lot on cultural safety, but every day is a learning day. But I'm happy to share what I know. I know that a lot of you have questions lined up for all of the people presenting. This will come out to you after the presentation today. It will be available on the website and can be sent to any of the attendees today. So I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to the day when I can actually hear participants. I love it when I can get feedback while I'm doing a presentation, but I hope that I helped a little bit in the cultural safety end of things. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Terry, for your presentation. It was definitely very powerful. And, I would like to express my appreciation for you to, sharing your life stories. And I think it's usually through stories that we can all get to know each other a bit more and also know about the context of the issues much more, in depth. And thank you for mentioning pie. Now I'm thinking about getting pie later. Because it's a long day. It's pretty rainy here in Vancouver as well today. So pie is good. So folks, thank you so much for your attendance so far. So I know we have people attending as employers. We have people attending from both unionized and non-unionized organizations, and also workers as well. So we have a diverse bunch of us here today, and we did get some questions. So let's start off with some of our questions, and we did get quite a few coming in. So I would first start off with maybe from the beginning, relating more to policies, regulations, and also legislation as well. We did get questions coming in about complaints. So I guess this is more of a question directed at Eric and Laura as well. We did get a question earlier asking about what happens if the complaint is against an employer versus an employee, and how would work-safe policies and regulations kind of cover, if an employee has a complaint, with regards to bullying, harassment against an employer. So maybe Eric can kind of start addressing
Yeah, so
that
I think if I understand the question, like if the employer is the actual bully or harasser in this scenario, who do they report to? So our policy states that it can be another, if there's HR, it can be a report to HR, it could be a report to a supervisor, or another report. And if not, like say in the example of a smaller business where there isn't an HR department and there's not really a lot of employees, if they don't have somebody else that the workers can report to, then our small business guide does speak to those workers being able to call WorkSafe BC. So that's when I said a little earlier, sometimes those calls do end up coming to us, and then we'll have to address those because I say there's a lot of really small businesses in BC, and not all of them have an HR department or somebody else that they can report to. But the employees or the employer, as part of their policy, should have another report as part of that. But in absence of that, then they can call WorkSafe BC. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And for Laura, on the discrimination side, I believe it's similar. It's the same process where they file a complaint in the Human Rights Tribunal.
Yeah, and in the human rights context, there's no requirement to report discrimination to your employer first before you can access the human rights complaint system for probably obvious reasons. Discrimination oftentimes is coming from the employer, from someone in a position of power within the company, for example. And so there's no requirement to have already tried to access any internal procedures that might exist before you file a human rights complaint. Sometimes that may be appropriate and may be the fastest and most effective way of dealing with the issue promptly and well, but there's no requirement to do that before you file a human rights complaint. All human rights complaints really that arise in the employment context should name the employer, should name the company or the nonprofit organization or whoever it is that you work for. If you're filing a human rights complaint, it should name your employer because the employer is responsible for the conduct of other employees. They are what's called vicariously liable for the conduct of other employees. So if you're experiencing discrimination at work, that's your employer's problem. And employers, it's important to know that you are responsible for providing and maintaining a discrimination-free workplace. And if you have an employee who is engaged in discriminatory conduct, the buck stops with you, and you can be held liable for that person's behavior.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Eric. So a further question leading on from this is, where do we draw the line of like a racist workplace issue, whether it's within the jurisdiction of WorkSafe BC or the Human Rights Tribunal? And what are some of the things that, employers and managers can kind of like think about and consider before determining where to go to first? So for example, if there is a racist incident involving violence, where should they go? Should they go to both, or should they just go to WorkSafe BC first to get some information and then filing a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal? How would that kind of look like for your managers or employees? Maybe we can start off with Eric first, and then we'll go over to Laura as well.
Yeah, so I guess in a violent situation, the employer would have to do an investigation into that and determine, what prompted this situation, right? So, we have a lot of violent situations. I can look at like healthcare where some people do end up getting assaulted by somebody and there may be a racial undertone to it, but there may be also like a cognitive disability that patient may have as well. So, the employer has to look into that. As far as WorkSafe is concerned, we want them to investigate that. And in a lot of cases, when it comes to violent incidents, we also say, hey, look, you probably should report that to the RCMP as well, or whatever police department has jurisdiction in your area. Because if you've actually been assaulted, there's only limited stuff that, WorkSafe obviously can't, hold that person responsible. It's a criminal act if somebody has been violent against you. But what we want to see is that the employer has investigated that and done everything that they can to prevent something like that moving forward. But again, for us, it's just the incident happened, the underlying issue as to why the employer would have to investigate, and then they would have to take the necessary steps from there, whether it's calling the BC Human Rights Tribunal, calling the police that have jurisdiction in the area or whatnot. So you can report it to us, and we'll look and see if the employer's done something. But if we see that there's some other underlying issue, then we'll likely provide that information to the caller, whoever reported it to us, that they can call whoever else that may have jurisdiction there.
Yeah, and Laura, anything to add to that piece?
I think the most helpful contribution I can make on that question is just to say that an employee who experiences discrimination at work always has the right to file a human rights complaint. And accessing another system or forum or legal regime does not bar you from filing a human rights complaint. So people can do both, or sometimes they can do 3 or 4 things. They can report to WorkSafe, and they can file a police complaint. And maybe they have a civil claim in court, or they have an employment standards complaint that they could also file. But if they've experienced discrimination, they always have access to the Human Rights Tribunal. So it's not uncommon that people have multiple proceedings going on in different places, and that's fine. There are some wrinkles and complications that can arise that are, I think, beyond the scope of where we need to go in this presentation today, but I wouldn't want anyone to think that if they have gone to WorkSafe, they can't go to the Human Rights Tribunal, for example. You can always file a human rights complaint if what has happened was discrimination based on a protected characteristic at work.
Thank you, Laura. So from understanding some of the processes that's taking place, for employer complaints, the onus does fall onto the employer because WorkSafe BC doesn't do investigations, and also nor does the Human Rights Tribunal. They don't do investigations, so the onus does come to the employer. So on the employer side, so what happens if the complaint is launched against top leadership or against certain higher ranking individuals within the organization? What would be some of the kind of considerations, or what would be some of the concerns from having these type of perceptions, right, in terms of complaining and submitting, feeling safe to submit complaints? So maybe I can ask maybe Alex to start off with a bit of the investigative process in terms of what are the obligations from employers, what are some of the information that they need to be aware of in terms of launching investigations internally, because the onus does go to the employer. So maybe Alex can have a bit of input on this aspect.
Yeah, the investigation process is very important. I mean, you have to do your due diligence. You have to look into, what actually happened, and give the employee an opportunity to tell their side of the story, and also just, interview everyone who's been involved in this. There is also external investigators that you can hire if you think there's some kind of bias that might be going on, by having someone within the organization do the investigation. So that's always an option for employers.
Yep. So maybe.
Yeah. Can I just add to that as well?
Of course. Yes, please.
Yeah. So, that's what we look at too. And then part of our policy statements that they have to have an investigation process that's fair and impartial. So like you said, it could be an external person, it could be internal. And the results of that investigation like Alex said, you have to involve the complainant, you have to involve the respondent, and you have to involve any witnesses that may have been brought forward as part of that complaint by that worker. And if that doesn't happen, then WorkSafe looks at it and be like, okay, so how come you didn't involve these workers, or how come you didn't involve this witness? And sometimes if the witness wasn't even there, right, they've just put somebody down as a witness, and again, they weren't a witness to the actual bullying and harassment that went on. So that may have been why they didn't. But you have to include all the people that are involved. And then that's where a BHQ complaint, that's where the bullying harassment complaint really comes to WorkSafe, is after that investigation has been done and the worker says this was not done fair and impartially. And then that's where WorkSafe will come in and take a look and say, did they follow their own policy exactly in how an investigation is to be done? And if so, then, we either say, yeah, that's investigation's been done fairly and impartially, or no. And then each the employer or the worker, whoever, is in disagreement can always come forward and review that order for either being inappropriate, disagreeing with the officer's outcome or decision based on what they had. But again, we have limited information, so we base our decision as best we can on that. But there is processes within WorkSafe BC to review an officer's decision, either that it was or was not a fair and impartial investigation.
I have a quick addition as well, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
I wanted to mention that the Human Rights Code prohibits retaliation for filing a human rights complaint or even indicating that you might or could file a human rights complaint. And it also prohibits retaliation against anyone who might help with a human rights complaint as a witness, helping someone to write up their complaint and file it with the Human Rights Tribunal. So just wanted to include that as well. Like other protections of the Human Rights Code, it is sort of backward looking. So the harm is done, the retaliation has occurred, and then you can file a retaliation complaint. But I did want to mention that the code does protect people from retaliation for asserting or seeking accountability for violations of their human rights.
Thank you. And
yeah, sorry, I just want to add that too. That
sure,
same with
course,
WorkSafe BC. Yeah, same with WorkSafe BC. That's what we have, that prohibitive action a complaint as well. So if you have brought forward a bullying harassment complaint and there's been some prohibitive action taken against you, then there is resources in WorkSafe BC to help address that as well.
Yeah, and relating back to the question on investigation, so we did mention about like witnesses and things like that. So from an employer's perspective or during the investigative process, if there are individuals that are named as witnesses, are they mandatory required to be, to participate? Or, for an employer, it might be a bit difficult sometimes if someone feels that they are privy to something, but they notice something, but at the same time, they may not be fully, comfortable in sharing these information. What is the kind of the framework in terms of from like the legal and the regulatory perspective that they are required to participate in these interviews for sharing their witness statements?
Wait, I guess I can take some of that too. So, employers are supposed to, or workers are supposed to follow the employer's policies and procedures. But if a witness doesn't feel comfortable or feels that they don't have anything to add to it, we're not going to hold them responsible for not participating in that. But workers should participate as much as they're able to. And that's in line with the employer's policy and procedures for investigations. But again, if you're not forced to be able to do that in a WorkSafe, in the eyes of WorkSafe BC, you don't have to do that, but you should as best as you can to your abilities.
Yeah, I agree that you wouldn't obligate them to participate in the investigation, but you would want them to participate to the best of their abilities. And I just want to add, in a unionized workplace, you would also ensure that you're allowing them to have union representation with them, so they have someone to represent them as well when they're in these investigative meetings.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Eric. So, so moving on over, shifting it over a little bit over in terms of, our topic from, investigations to, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what would be some of the best practices in translating these, DEI policies into actual tangible actions and cultural change in the workplace? Maybe we can start with Alex, on the implementation piece and the policy piece, and then maybe Terry can share some as well from the cultural safety aspect and maybe some of your personal experiences as an HR manager.
Yeah, Thank you, Harrison. That's a big question. I would say most importantly, top-down leadership, being able to practice what you preach and not just putting words on paper and creating a policy. And then I think, as Eric was talking about, you have to follow these policies. Yeah, it's not just words. And then also looking within your organization, and there's a lot of legwork that goes into seeing where there might be you might be falling short, there might be some weaknesses, might be some biases, and doing that legwork prior to actually putting pen to paper and drafting a policy that works for your organization.
Yeah, adding to what you've said, I can also say that you need to be brave. You need to have those difficult conversations. You can't develop a policy that is going to work unless you have those brave conversations and accept feedback. Because the one thing that I think all of us have learned is staff will always give you feedback when you give them the right conditions, circumstances. They're going to share their knowledge, and their knowledge may not match what you know.
Gather that data.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and that's exactly what makes this webinar in the beginning so difficult. When Safinder and I were thinking about what to do, that's why we included all of our speakers today. It's because everything's interconnected, and I think that piece is very important. That there's a regulatory aspect, there's a legal aspect, there's a organizational aspect which ties into your organization's culture, policies, and it's the overall conversation that you have with your employees as well. And of course, for employees and for workers here, it's also about how comfortable you feel, right? In terms of conveying issues and bringing these items up. So that's why it's all interconnected. But at this, but leading off from that, I do have another further question here. So what are, sorry, there's actually another question that just came in from one of, the attendees. So if there is, back to investigations. So with bullying and harassment discrimination, bullying and harassment investigations. So what if there's no witnesses and it's only one person's word against another person's word? In these situations, what would be the advice, from the panelists here to advise, employers to do if they're faced with a situation in an investigation where it's just one person's word against another? Maybe we can start off with Eric, then to Laura, and then to Alex, and to Terry.
Yeah, those ones can be quite difficult. What are the advices is document as much stuff as possible, right? Document as many interactions as possible, right? So I know we've had this with employers where workers have come back and said that they were bullied and harassed and all this, based on the fact that they were let go or for whatever reason. And employers have been able to document all those interactions and been able to say, look, no, this was what was happening. This is what we did. And so they had the evidence to, when an investigator, obviously a third party, because you can't investigate yourself, that investigator would look at that evidence and weigh that, right, and determine whether or not bullying and harassment occurred or not. And it may not be possible to fully determine if it had or hadn't, right, if there's not enough evidence either way. So I think the best advice I could say is document everything, especially as an employer. If you are doing disciplinary action or things like that, documenting that so that in the end it can be, look, no, this is how it went, right? It wasn't us bullying them. It was legitimate workplace, critique or whatnot else, right? So it's documentation is key. Like that's where we've seen a lot of people have either had it go their way or not, is because they've had the evidence to back that up in absence of having any witnesses. So like I say, it's tough when it's one person against the other and there's no witnesses or any sort of evidence.
Yeah, I think I would just add, think creatively. Are there other ways to learn more about the situation or maybe what led up to it? How has this person's conduct been in other contexts? Are there people who have had similar experiences with this individual in the past. You know, you should look to the circumstances surrounding the specific event as opposed to just fixating on the specific event at which there were no witnesses, to see if the surrounding circumstances help persuade you one way or the other, that one or the other person's version of events is more credible or more likely to have occurred. And as I mentioned, like at the Human Rights Tribunal, it's not uncommon to have a situation where there were no witnesses and it's one person's testimony against another person's testimony with two very different versions of events. And that's what the tribunal member has to do in deciding, what do I believe happened? Whose story is more credible? Which story hangs together better? Which story makes sense when it's sort of situated within the larger context and other circumstances that we can determine? So yeah, not to suggest that it's easy, but perhaps the recommendation is to think a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, collecting evidence and just ensuring that you're collecting evidence in a timely manner. Memories can fade, people can leave. You know, it's important to do your due diligence at that time and not after the fact when, you know, it's too late.
It gets a little difficult in a union environment because when it's one person against another, it's also one representative against another. And sometimes the language that each union representative use can actually determine, and Eric, you would be experienced at this and saying who tells the story best. But in those kind of cases, we will often pull in an independent investigator for simply that reason, just to give everybody a fair shake. Hopefully you do have documentation on past incidences or experiences, but sometimes it is best to bring in someone that's independent and removed from the situation.
And thank you, all four of you, for that input, because I think it's important for us to kind of share that piece from different perspectives and different angles. So let's see here. We are about to reach our allocated 2 hours time, and I just want to emphasize that, you know, today's webinar, it's not the one-all be-all session for tackling racism and cultural safety. The purpose of all of this is to equip all of us with knowledge and tools to build capacity and resiliency within our own respective organizations and communities. And this is a topic which will be discussed in the days, weeks, and years to come as it evolves. If there are specific topics in the webinar today which you would like future sessions on, please do fill out the survey, which will be sent out by CSS HSA, of course. And at the same time, I want to sincerely hope that you've all personally found something beneficial from the webinar today. I will pass the mic back to Satvinder now for a few final remarks then. Thank you.
Thank you, Harrison. You know, I think that when Harrison and I were planning this session about a year ago, we knew that this was going to be a very challenging and very difficult endeavor. And, you know, we covered a lot of ground this morning together. And the hope is that, you know, the work that CLASS is doing, WorkSafe is doing, CCIA is doing, you know, is going to branch out to these topics. So future webinars will sort of focus on, so we can always come back to this particular session, you know, as we're moving forward. You know, I have to express, you know, the most, you know, this is such a diverse and such a fantastic presentations right around, you know, this square box. And I think that, you know, I'd like to express, Harrison and I would like to express our appreciation to Eric, to Laura, to Alex and Terry for such outstanding information in such a short period of time and coming together to be a part of this. You know, I really want to thank Harrison. Like, wow, like, have you done this before? You know, you're a pro. Really thankful to you for that.
It's our first time facilitating. So,
well, there you go. First time.
Give me a bit of
well done indeed. And also Anna, who's been, working in the background tirelessly and sort of facilitating that. Thank you, Anna, so much. And to you folks for being a part of this session. And so there are a few items I wanted to share with you before you wrap up. And that is that there are 2 upcoming webinars that are going to be happening. One in October around the preliminary rates for community social services in late October. A discussion and WorkSafe will be presenting along with us to the sector. There is also some exciting stuff happening with the BC Municipality Safety Association on the Certificate of Recognition program for our sector. And, we'll be sharing an update for our sector with respect to that particular program, which interestingly enough feeds into the safety, the health and safety culture and how it builds into this and a lot of the conversations that we're having earlier today. The other part is that I will be engaged in industry outreach across the province in October and November. And so the details are being fine-tuned. And I really look forward to meeting with you in person. Once this information is out next week, I encourage you to share that with your organizations and sister organizations and unions and workers as this comes out, because I'm really looking forward to engaging with you directly and hope to see you in person. Now, there is another sort of question that kind of came up about our health and safety. The association does provide a newsletter on our website. Please go to our website and you'll find a lot of the materials there with respect to WorkSafe BC updates and literature and just sort of what the kind of programs and services that we're working on and developing for the industry as well. So I encourage you to look into that. This particular session, these presentations will be on our website. So we'll be linking that out to everybody to access and get a hold of that. And with that, we'd like to thank you for being a part of this session this morning. We encourage you to continue the great work that you do in your communities each and every day. And we're very thankful that you spent the time with us this morning. And with that, I'd like to conclude this session. Thank you. And have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.